All of you, please support it financially. There is a cost to everything we provide. Please silence all cell phones and things that make noises. Dr. Stephen Windmueller is Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at the Jack H. Skirball campus of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. The author of 4 books and numerous articles, Professor Windmueller holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of Pennsylvania. His research has been primarily focused on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. He recently served as guest editor of USC's Kasdan Institute, producing The Impact of Donald Trump's Presidency on American Jews and Israel, and is now focused on producing a volume analyzing the 21st century American Judaism. He continues to write on Jewish political and behavior for the Times of Israel and other publications in advance of the November 2024 election. Later this summer, Dr. Windmueller will be teaching in South Africa at the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, Jewish Board of Deputies of South Africa, and Limud, South Africa. He is here today with his wife, Michelle, Dr. Michelle Windmueller, what else do I have to say? And he is thrilled to be invited back to the Everett Center. I had to say that. Please welcome Dr. Windmueller.
Thank you so much for the introduction. My appreciation to Arlene Hoffman and to the committee that has been hosting us, and to the Everett Center for its extraordinary work over these past number of years, and to Richard for being my tech savior and guide. This afternoon, we're going to take a look at October 7th and beyond. Oops.
Sorry, I jumped you.
Okay, oh, there we go, okay. That's good. And to explore in some detail the implications of all that has happened and all that is unfolding. In so many ways, it is the poetry of Israelis at this moment that is profoundly moving and particularly challenging. I have explored the vast amount of literature that Israelis are producing because in some measure it is telling us the sense of loss, the issue of trust, the question of hope, as well as the concerns about a sense of what the future may hold. Indeed, this is a moment in which we want to reflect on a number of factors. No question that this has been, in terms of the ability of world Jewry to be responsive to Israel and its needs, an extraordinary 9-month framework. More dollars were contributed to various Jewish charitable Israeli-based institutions than at any point in the history of the Jewish people. The $2 billion plus that has been generated has gone to such purposes and causes as Israel's response in terms of trauma, its efforts in terms of its Magen David Adom, its Red Cross, its concerns and associated interests with regard to the role of the Jewish Agency, the impact of IsraAid and other such institutions in Israel committed to immediate response and trauma intervention. It has also been a moment in time in which we have understood that we have moved through 9 months, but those 9 months are not the same. There were periods of extraordinary unity and coming together, as was evidenced by the 14th of November, when 300,000 of us gathered in Washington, D.C. to become part of a kind of common statement of concern for Israel, its hostages, and the long term. But we have noticed a kind of unraveling, a sense of disconnect that has occurred post-November 14th. And what we have begun to observe as well is the kind of critical definitions and breakdowns, both by generations, but also by interests, in terms of what the behaviors and responses have been. part of this sense of identity and sense of confronting the Israeli situation has been involved in terms of what we have observed on the campuses. Most of those events occur within a 3-week period, the end of March and parts of April, involving 147 campuses and over 10,000 students, faculty, and administrators, involving a kind of combination of civility and incivility, of violence and certainly of nonviolence. But it has starked, and it is in its starkest moments, has reminded us of the extraordinary emotional issues associated with this conflict and the rise of a kind of reactionism against Israel that we have not seen or fully appreciated in the past. It has also been a period in which we have seen a different form of anti-Semitism emerge. It is an attack on the collective Jewish people. Historically, we would look at anti-Semitism as an individualized statement against specific Jewish behaviors or actions. But this is about the collective Jewish people, the state of Israel, the idea of Zionism, all of which come under this assault in terms of a different kind of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic form of response. This has also been a period in which I suggested at the outset of an extraordinary amount of music and art and literature, and in particular poetry, both by Israelis but also here in diasporic terms, in terms of how we have dealt with the emotional pieces of this story and the specific stories, individual and collective, of the hostages. It has also been a period in which we have experienced the Great Silence. The questions of why there were no voices on the 7th and the 8th and the 9th of October and beyond who would join us or who would be responsive to and for Israel at this moment. And that becomes a sort of ongoing initiative and question for us in terms of how we deal with the political discourse or the failure to draw folks together with us in this moment. But it has also been a period in which we have seen a kind of awakening in the American Jewish community, which we will want to talk about as we move forward. Something that we have not experienced except in 1967 and to some degree in 1973 following the Yom Kippur War, which we will want to break out and understand more fully. That awakening is understood in the context that rabbis, communal professionals, and Jewish educators are telling us across the board that literally hundreds of folks who are marginally Jewish, not necessarily affiliated with synagogues, schools, camps, and federations, have been responsive to the events since the 7th of October, and have understood the importance of finding their place, their voice, their presence in the Jewish community. And that's been reflected in the context of new donors, of new synagogue members, of new children going into day schools, of a kind of reawakening of identity for those who are both involved, but also for many who were outside of the institutional boundaries of our community. We've in a sense seen this coming together that we spoke about November, but we've also seen the sense of being isolated and pretty much alone. That sense of both where political voices would be and where communal voices might be in the context of understanding the evolution of how a struggle such as this has a kind of life of its own and different moments of intensity and also of separation. The deep political divide that we see is heavily generational. It is tied in so many ways to what my colleague Jonathan Kessler and I have begun to explore, which are the letters that our kids and grandkids are writing to us. Letters written by day school graduates. I'm going to cite to you one such letter by the Charles E. Smith Day School in Washington, D.C., where alumni wrote to the school leadership, "You misled us. You did not teach us. You did not lead us in a way that we would be able to cope with Israel. We understand this conflict in a different context. We are concerned about the concerns that you told us Israel was about liberation and tikkun olam. And yet we feel that Israel has violated that, and that the Zionism you spoke about is not our Zionism. Such letters existed between the children and grandchildren of the rabbis and rabbinic leadership in this country who wrote to the Union for Reform Judaism their concerns about feeling disconnected from what was happening and feeling that their parents, their rabbis, their fathers and mothers had misrepresented Israel. Or the hundreds of other letters that we now have uncovered of young Jewish professionals who disagree with the ways in which some of their organizations have responded, sort of aligning themselves with Israel and feeling, in a sense, that that is not the Israel that they had come to understand as a society open, vital, and in so many ways responsive to the rights of minorities and others. So this generational divide of Gen Zs seeing themselves as somehow outside of the community and feeling politically separate from the rest of the community is a major issue for the Jewish community moving forward as we deal with the questions of how we teach, engage, and embrace Zionism and Israel. And indeed, Zionism itself is in a sense on trial, because it is the challenge we have of trying to market and embrace it and explain it in ways that our kids and even our opponents will more fully appreciate and come to understand. But this is also a moment of many more longer-term challenges. The questions about whether this is a conflict that will come to an end shortly, or whether this is simply the beginning of a series of conflicts that Israel must contend with regarding Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen, or the Islamic Jihad in Syria, or the Iranian Republic, all of which are potential challenges to Israel's security and safety moving forward. For us, the dynamic numbers of what has happened in this country has so radically changed us in terms of our sense of security and safety. And as I referenced yesterday, the significant numbers of American Jews who speak about the fact that anti-Semitism is raw and ripe in their minds in terms of what it may mean and how it is manifested, as reflected simply by these numbers reported to us by the ADL, but equal data from the FBI and from other sources confirming this accelerated increase of harassment, discrimination, and a sense that in social media, for example, there is a kind of conversation that is ugly, raw, and challenging to Jewish voices. I think what is ahead for us, regardless of what occurs actually in the Middle East at the moment, is that our immediate concerns remain very much about the security of our institutions and our own lives. And this extraordinary amount of investments being made by state and local officials and federal authorities, along with our own nonprofit institutions, in protecting, defending, and securing the institutions which we use, our schools, our camps, our synagogues, our communal agencies, and all the facilities that the American and global Jewish community uses and supports. It is also about education. How do we redesign the notion of Israel studies, Zionist education, history of the Middle East, the story of the Jewish people? Because much of that seems to have been lost. And knowing that we are living with a generation that does not know history, has not experienced the history we have lived through, it becomes an extraordinary challenge of how we return to that centerpiece of a Jewish life, which deals with these issues of the reimagining of Zionism, the reformulation of Israel studies, but the continuous and ongoing task of providing context, memory, and history to a generation that has not been a part of the storylines of the 20th century. It is also about advocacy and partnerships. Next week, I will have published a piece in E-Jewish Philanthropy, a publication that is read in the field of American Jewish communal affairs, that will deal with the issue of how we build coalitions or rebuild them. Because coalitions have been central to the American Jewish story and will become an important piece as we move forward. And the issue will be who will be our partners and how will we identify folks who accept two core premises: that racism and anti-Semitism have no place in the conversation and conduct of such relationships, and the second, a recognition of the State of Israel, its right to exist, its right to self-defense, and an acknowledgement of the complexities of the Middle East that go along with the story of the Arab-Israel agenda. Advocacy and partnerships will be an extraordinary piece of the work that the Jewish community will need to play. And it will be tied to the notion that we cannot partner with folks who deny us a place in the contemporary political story. And it will be a partnership that will also require us to make some concessions to others in terms of their agendas and their priorities. But that will be a core task as we move forward. We will learn a great deal about ourselves over these months and certainly over this year. And crisis planning will become a central piece to many Jewish institutional tasks that go forward from here. How do synagogues, federations, JCCs, and other institutions rethink the ways by which they are prepared to deal in crisis or to manage in such situations? And how do we provide the kind of leadership and direction not only to our own community, but are in partnership with Israelis and others in the global Jewish scene in understanding that these are moments for both learning and for adjustments in the context of our history and experience. It is also the time for memorializing the loss of soldiers, of those injured, and of those who remain hostage, and of those who have been unfortunately killed during the events on the 7th itself. It is important that we do not forget those moments and those persons, because they become part of this story, and they become part of what we will need to teach others moving forward. There is an extraordinary economic outcome here as well. The outcome on two fronts. On the Israeli front of the rebuilding of a state, pieces of Israel's society that have been torn apart and disrupted, both in the north, but clearly in the south. And all of that infrastructural work, along with rebuilding lives and the capacity of people to return to some kind of normalcy ultimately, will be an important agenda item for the global Jewish community. But internally, in the American Jewish scene and elsewhere, many Jewish groups made a clear determination in October that they would refrain from being active in the fundraising world, in the campaign worlds of raising money for domestic causes, for Jewish family and childcare services, for JCCs, for synagogues, for schools, on the hopes that the goal and direction here would be toward meeting the core needs, the $2 billion plus that has already been raised and more that will be raised in managing this global issue of Israel's safety and security. Those issues for our home communities will be very challenging, marked by the fact that we are seeing a number of institutions that are struggling at this moment precisely because of this commitment to reprioritize our directions. And also, in the end, we will have to rethink, in a sense, our political stance as a community. How do we market Israel? How do we rebuild the advocacy relationships? And how do we engage in that, both on the local but also on the federal level, in terms of building a support for Israel, even against the odds that those who oppose Israel are marshaling huge resources today to challenge us in various settings. I want to remind ourselves that we're living in an American Jewish community that is really bifurcated. It's two communities historically. The legacy Jewish institutions, these are our federations, our national agencies, many of our synagogues, and certainly many of the core instruments that were part of our lives from the period of 1880 to 1985 that sort of created the essence of our community. But beginning in the period of 1985, we would see a kind of second American Jewish revolution, the rise of the boutique model organizations. And you know them all. You were probably donors and participants in many of them. And there are literally hundreds of them that have come into being between 1985 and 2005, and even beyond 2005. And we think of them as Mazon, J Street, the Republican Jewish Coalition, American Jewish World Service, and the list grows well beyond that in terms of groups that are single issue, that are bottom up, that are entrepreneurial, that are very focused on their founders and the founders' vision of what the organizations would become. And these are organizations today that are playing key roles in climate change. They are involved in Jewish education and culture, in Israel advocacy and Israel education. They are committed to various social justice causes, to various religious initiatives, and they are really become a kind of second voice in the American Jewish structural development. You will ask, I know, at the end, why 1985? There are four factors here that have created why this revolution took place. First of all, in the mid-1980s, we saw the largest exchange of wealth from one Jewish generation to another, as the sort of folks who were part of the extraordinary Second World War era began to move away from their positions of leadership, power, and authority, and transcend that to the next generation of leaders, their children and grandchildren. And that would generate an interesting response, because those newfound wealth holders did not turn to the federation system or to our synagogues per se, but created foundations and became themselves funders. So we saw the largest growth of foundations and funders in the Jewish world in our history, as we would see the explosion of literally hundreds of family foundations and a rebirth of community foundations giving away monies. So that the wealth agenda in the Jewish community has shifted from the federation marketplace to the role of family funders and foundations. The second factor is that after the Yom Kippur War, we saw one additional moment of conflict in Israel. We saw that built around the Peace for Galilee campaign in 1981, where many American Jews disagreed with Israel's choice of invading Lebanon. And Ariel Sharon's efforts to deal with the PLO at that point in South Lebanon drew huge and conflicting responses. And out of that comes a kind of first reaction of criticism of Israeli policy by diaspora Jewry. And with it comes a whole series of other events. We see for the first time the First Intifada, which occurs in 1985. We see for the first time the challenge of who is a Jew question in the Israeli Supreme Court. We see for the first time in this period the rise of institutions here in the United States that were questioning Israel on human rights, on settlements, and on a host of other domestic and international issues. So we frame that in the context of what has evolved since 1985 to understand why that is significant. So the last factor here is that this would be a period in which we would also see a significant change in attitudes about Israel, the beginning of questions and challenges. But we have also faced additional issues that are impacting us right at this moment, even as we are well beyond some of these. The 2008 economic recession was profoundly significant to the American Jewish community. It fundamentally downgraded many institutions and created a kind of counter-response to how the community would manage itself, operate, and organize. And that was particularly significant because it comes on the heels of the Bernie Madoff scandal. And that, plus the economic recession, would drain various organizations of resources and create a profound imprint and impact on our ability to operate. No doubt the social media revolution has changed the very way that the Jewish community functions, how individuals receive information, how ideas are distributed, but also the challenges to the Jewish community that we have seen well before October the 7th, but have contributed as well to the myths and mythologies and misinformation that has defined this period of the past 9 months. And we have seen the arrival of Generation Z, which we have already addressed. All of these factors are contributors to the events we're living with at this moment and add to the complexities of our story. And no doubt, our own political upheaval, both internal to the Jewish community over what kind of Israel do we want to support and by which we stand or recognize, and by also our own American political agenda. So this has been the complexities of really a community that has gone through a significant amount of transition and transformation, the late 20th century into the early decades of the 21st century. I think in so many ways we are dealing with issues about who we are and how we see ourselves. And part of that is this new reality, the anti-Semitism which we've spoken about, the sense of concern we have about Israel's safety and security, the questions we have about what kind of Israel will emerge, as well as managing and dealing with our own sense of political homelessness, as we see elements on the far left challenging the Democratic Party, and on the far right in terms of attitudes and expressions historic to anti-Semitic behavior. And the questions become clear in terms of finding our sort of spot, our place within the American scenario about which we spoke yesterday. And as referenced in our commentary on the American political scene, the notion of where we sit as white people, or are we white people? And if you were with us yesterday, you will remember, it's not part of the final exam, by the way, that we spoke about the notions of those on the far left who questioned our minority status and saw us now as white because we were established, successful, powerful. We had become white in their minds. And as you will recall, I spoke to the issue of the far right in terms of "you will not replace us," the language used in Charlottesville, to remind us of the premise that our whiteness is being perceived as our effort to grab power, to take over, to replace Anglo-Saxons and the existing white establishment. So whiteness and white peoplehoodness has become a powerful notion in terms of how our enemies perceive us as somehow different and somehow disconnected from their scenarios of what America ought to be and of our role as they would define it. I think this is all very personal. I'm not sure that we've ever sort of stepped away to realize how emotionally engaged we have become with the hostages, with the storylines of Israel, with the questions of the future of the Palestinians, with issues associated with how America is responsive or ought to be responsive to these questions. And I think in that sense, it is not simply a public agenda and a public concern. It is very much a personal and private one. It is the battles we have with our kids over questions about Israel, its status, its right to exist, its definition on Zionism, its role as a, quote, colonial, apartheid society, and how we sort of manage those conflicts at home, in the community, and certainly globally. It is the larger questions of how the Jewish community will move forward, feeling safe, but also feeling assertive, being able to articulate a direction, a course, moving forward. Here I've encountered audiences who have been very critical of our national agencies and community institutions, who feel that there is an absence of Jewish leadership and have struggled with the questions of not feeling that the community has a way forward or has begun to articulate a kind of vision for the American Jewish future. And that may be part of the conversations moving us all collectively forward in terms of where do we fit both in connection with Israel, but also in connection with our national identity, our American story. So these are huge issues that I think are going to be challenging to the American Jewish community and to us personally as we embrace our kids, our grandkids, and our neighbors. We don't know whether this is just the beginning and maybe just the end of a particular moment in time where Israel returns to a kind of status of living in a difficult neighborhood, or whether this difficulty is going to grow in terms of Israel's need to be responsive to Hezbollah and the other elements I've described earlier. Israel has a 7-tier war in front of itself, 7 distinctive enemies that are challenging the Jewish state. And so that creates in and of itself the question of how do you deal with all of these potential conflicts? And what are the possibilities that were clear before the 7th of October that the Trump administration began and the Biden administration sought to achieve in terms of bringing Saudi Arabia closer to Israel? It is the belief of some political scientists that the decision on the 7th of October by the Hamas forces to attack was precisely designed to disrupt the Saudi-American-Israeli connection. And that may well be. Yeah. Yet the intelligence sources tell us that the attack was originally scheduled for Passover of last spring. But notice that the attack does occur on a Jewish holiday. Yes, it's Shabbat, but it is also part of Simchat Torah. And we need to understand that the significance here is that our enemies fully appreciate, as with the Yom Kippur War, that they will identify moments that are sacred, important, and holy to the Jewish people, to use those moments as an opportunity to challenge and seek to defeat us. I think it's significant that we realize that there is a lot behind these events that simply become part of the storyline even as we pass through them, having to do with the longer-term interests of both parts of the United States foreign policy agenda in the Middle East, which include building a much more holistic approach to countering China's presence in the region, buffeting Russian influence, and seeking to build a core of relationships with key Arab countries beyond Egypt and Jordan, and move clearly to involve countries associated with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others. And this becomes a particularly challenging moment in the context that when this war unfolds, it has, as a result, delayed or maybe forever postponed this initiative to create a different kind of outcome in the Middle East. No doubt, I think we continue to worry about the Russian-Iranian alliance, as we appropriately ought to. We must be concerned about Chinese investments and efforts to build a role for itself in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and in Southwest Asia in the case of the Middle East. So I see this as simply not just a Jewish-Israeli question, but having profound importance for American foreign policy and American interests well beyond this border. I'm going to just skip that one. And ending with this, I think at this moment we need to deal with those emotions that I spoke about earlier. Because in so many ways, this is not simply happening outside of us. Yes, the events, the people, and the storyline in many ways is the Middle East. But we are connected. The American Jewish Committee study last week pointed to the extraordinary sense of connectedness that American Jews have with Israel. 91% of us, according to their study, have this particular attachment, whether it is always a kind of love affair with Israel, but it is certainly an emotional and social and political connection to Israel. And whether we agree or disagree with all that Israel does and represents, nonetheless, in the context of that, there is this sense of loss and fear, concern for the welfare of its people, and certainly of the idea of the Jewish state. And I think it's also the issues associated with the kind of angst that we feel as American Jews, as Americans, in terms of the context of where we are in this moment, and uncertain about the political future here as well, or as more directly, our own sort of status and state as part of that community. It will be the rethinking on Zionism that now is happening by Jewish scholars and teachers about how we teach Israel studies. Have we lost Gen Zs? Will they come back to us on Israel? Or will we now need to move to the next sort of generational component in building a different sort of model of how Zionism is understood as not evil, as not colonial, as not problematic, but as something that is really quite extraordinary, a kind of national liberation, expression, and experience. And how will we convey that to our kids and grandkids and to their kids and their grandkids? This then becomes the extraordinary challenge that we face. We are at an incredibly difficult but also promising moment in the American Jewish story. New institutions, the capacity to do many things because of our resources, our status as an established and affirmed community. But it is also a moment in which we need to confront the individual tensions, the collective concerns, and the historic realities that Jewish history, in some measure, has a kind of tendency to repeat itself. And the capacity of our own leadership to give guidance and direction and hope to a community that is desperate for feeling whole and secure yet again. Thank you. So I know that there will be questions here on the side if you wish to offer them.
Hi, Steve. Could you speak to the failure of public relations after October 7th with regard to the Jewish response versus the pro-Hamas Palestinian response?
First of all, I think that the Israelis at the outset did really reasonably well at at the outset. But over the course of time, their ability to put in context what was happening has been more problematic. Part of that is because they're competing with nightly news of media shots of what is going on in Gaza, of hungry people, of destroyed schools, of thousands of deaths. And it creates this extraordinary media challenge. And I don't think they ever recovered from how they could manage that and ought to manage that. There are groups of Jewish media consultants in this country that have been really trying to get the Israelis to rethink the ways they put a communication strategy together and to build that as a way to manage better their story. But unfortunately, you're dealing with a sovereign nation, and one can offer suggestions and prod and push, but the decision-making sits in Jerusalem and not elsewhere. I think this has been a historic challenge for Israel. Their ability, especially in conflict situations, to manage effectively news coverage and their story, their rationale. So it's not new to the 7th of October or to these months, but it's an ongoing challenge for the Israelis. You will hear Israelis tell you that they could care less about what the other thinks, but we in the diaspora sort of feel it and see it in very different eyes and lenses. And so that becomes the particular challenge for a diaspora jury to engage with Israelis to help them better understand that their story ultimately becomes in some measure our story, and they have to be able to work with us in doing a better job in this context.
Thank you. I would concur. As a public relations professional, I think we have a huge PR Israel problem. But my question is, as a mother of 2 Gen Z, 23 and 26, I can't even begin to verbalize my sadness and frustration, and I know you're not a therapist, but I wonder if you could give, from an intellectual or a dialogue perspective, how we speak to our children. Thank you.
That's a very, very tough call or question. I think the best option here is that somehow parents and grandparents may not be the connectors here. We need to hope that their circle of friends include folks who are able to articulate a perspective about Israel that aligns with a support or more positive perspective. Because it is peer relationships for Gen Zs that are particularly significant, especially for the age group you recite or identify. So I'm not certain how helpful any of us can be. Possibly in the classroom, if there are faculty who are supportive of Israel, and we have a university community that is, in many cases, maybe one of the more problematic pieces to our capacity to be responsive. But to those faculty who are embracing and supportive, they may have a voice that might be listened to, both because of their expertise, and the sort of status they may hold for students in some situations. But I think it begins with peer engagement and maybe in university environments. That's the best I can offer you.
us Jewish people, especially many older people who have gone through the Holocaust, are afraid. They're afraid of everybody around them. And this is America. We shouldn't be afraid in America. And we have to kind of demand that. As a matter of fact, I want to go back to one example. It's too bad that happened at the time. But when all the students in the colleges and universities have started a personal reaction about the Jews in the campuses, and it caused a tremendous, I don't know, I felt terrible. I said, how come that this can happen in America? And it did, because nobody opened up their mouth, that those students who initiated it had no place in that American university. That's the only thing I want to say, because a lot of things came from there. And we're looking at the past with the very first anti-Jewish behavior in public. Thank you.
Much of the organizing of the campus protests were actually from outside. Much of the funding is from outside. We need to unpack a lot of that to understand how the organizing initiatives took place and how they were ultimately able to operate on the campuses. Many of the universities had no policies, or if they had policies about campus organizing and campus dissent, they did not always enforce them. So as a result, we had universities that were acting, in a sense, after the fact, and were not doing what we would have expected or hoped for. And so some of that is now being accounted for, as we've seen the resignations of certain university presidents. We're seeing efforts to redesign university conduct codes in terms of what is acceptable and unacceptable. We will see a number of lawsuits filed against certain universities. We're likely to also see a good deal more information about the organizing strategies used by those folks who were involved in this initiative. It will show itself in a very ugly form in Chicago in a few weeks at the Democratic Convention. We expect a huge number of demonstrations and efforts to disrupt the convention. So I think this is part of an ongoing scenario, and where we're likely to have a good amount of work to do in terms of both identifying how and what is happening, but also in the best strategies for response, and holding universities in particular accountable for the safety, security, and well-being of other students, including our own. It places increasing burdens actually on our Hillels and our other Jewish institutions to figure out ways that they can best serve our students. Because, and the bottom line is that Hillel is, as an example, is there to sort of support and embrace and hold our students in safety and giving them a sense of wholeness and Jewish security.
There's so much anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli feeling among the academic professors in higher education. And this isn't just started with October 7th. This goes back, I can remember 20, 30 years arguing with professors about this kind of stuff. Why? Why that community is so anti?
Why are academics so anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, or some anti-Semitic? First of all, what we haven't really paid much attention to is that there's been some significant organizing by Arab American groups in taking academics to Israel, academics to the Arab world, and in introducing them to an alternative sort of message line about the Arab case and so forth. The second is that we have a lot of evidence to suggest that Arab governments over these years have been funding institutes, think tanks, professorships, and that has created additional energy and support for a kind of pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel framework. And it is joined together by other issues. And I spoke to some of that yesterday when I talked about postmodernism, where postmodernism sort of sees Israel as part of the problem, as part of the established, Western, imposed world that was created in 1948, post-Second World War, and thereby creating the framework by which Arab peoples were displaced and others were, losing their political rights. And so this becomes a kind of conflict over two views of the world. A perspective that America is a white racist society and is imposed its white racism and beliefs in a kind of universal way as expressed or as an example by the formation and creation and support for the State of Israel. So that becomes part of that larger cohort of beliefs about how people perceive the world. And if you perceive the world as divided this way between white and non-whites, Jews are, as I've talked about here, captured in the whiteness phase.
First of all, thank you for giving us space to talk about these things and think about these things. It's hard and painful for many of us. So I teach Jewish high school students, and it's been a tough year there, And one of the things that I've come to see is that they don't differentiate Israel, when you talk about Israel and support for Israel, from the Israeli government, the current Israeli government and the recent Israeli government, and some of the things that they hear and they see. And I just wonder if you could tease that out a little bit. It's very hard to do that, but that's their view of Israel now.
Well, I think we have a very different kind of Israel government today than we've had, and that creates for many people, be they high school kids or older, a major concern, because it is a different framework of Zionism and a different context of how they see Israel in the world. And so this coalition that exists is distinctively a different model, and that is hard to interpret to a young person that, in a political society where you have a democracy and you have a parliament and political parties coalesce, and in this case, the right, this particular set of right-wing parties has the vote, has the capacity to control some 63, 64 seats in a 120-person Knesset, and that gives them the ability to impose a particular perspective about what they see in the world and what they see for Israel and what they see about the Palestinians. And that is challenging because in a democracy we can't always get what we personally may want, and that becomes a lesson unto itself. And the Israeli people, even before, as you know, the 7th of October, every week for 40-odd weeks were on the streets after Shabbat, demonstrating having to do with the courts, the Supreme Court and other court systems, and the Israeli policies that were being proposed by the current coalition. And so I think one has to point to the fact that Israel is a very vital democratic state with many perspectives about what it ought to look like and how it ought to function. But you also have to be candid with your students, that there is no significant center-left in Israel, that political movement which founded the state, which grew the state, has pretty well diminished. And we have to live with a current reality of the Israel polity, which is center-right, and in some cases extreme right. And that's the nature of politics in Israel.
Professor, I don't think you've mentioned much about the effect of intermarriage on Jewish identity. I wonder if you feel it's had a positive, negative, or neutral effect on where we are now.
Okay, Arlene, if you're listening, that's another lecture. It's a very important question. We have good and bad news here. I would tell you that the Pew study suggests today that since roughly 2010, almost 7 out of every 10 marriages involving a Jewish person involves a Jewish person with a non-Jewish partner. So it's roughly 70% of marriages in this past sort of 14-year, 15-year cycle that would frame what's happening. And of course, we've known that intermarriage since roughly the 1990s has really accelerated. It was 3% in 1970. It was, closer to 50% at the turn of the century into the 21st century. But now we see it fully, as part of the Americanization of the Jewish community. The interesting piece here is that when these folks have kids, and the data suggests that they more often opt to be Jewish and select a Jewish lifestyle. Now, what extent of lifestyle that may involve is how deeply embedded they are in a synagogue or in other Jewish life opportunities, expressions of community. That's a more complicated issue. But the fact that many of these folks are seeking to be connected to the community if they have children is a hopeful sign, which points to why the Jewish population data suggests a somewhat of a growth. And the other part to that growth is the rise of American Orthodoxy, which will be very significant in the second half of the 21st century as a very dominant force within American Jewish life. So I don't know that I can take you much more deeper than that at the moment, but it suggests that it's an avenue for a huge amount of transition that we will see. And the most significant piece for today's conversation is that the connections to Israel are far less rooted in these couples and in these relationships, precisely because they've not necessarily brought Israel into those marriage scenarios, into those lives. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
My question is, do you think that the Jewish community has isolated itself from its neighbors with our growth in Jewish institutions and Jewish day schools and Jewish education? That's my question.
Joe, there is a battle undergoing in the community right now since the 7th of October about, do we turn inward or do we continue to try to be portrayed and view ourselves as very much in conversation with, in dialogue and in partnership with others. And I think that the diaspora communities historically have had to balance this. On one hand, you want a kind of educated and knowledgeable Jewish constituency, but you also want that constituency to be fully engaged in the larger societies in which they live, because that is an important step in building relationships and connections for political, but well beyond political purposes. Yeah. So I think it's this very clever but very careful balance between how deeply we turn inward and what strategies we use to be in the world, in the community. Thank you all so very much for your attention.